Thrawn's return was presented as a turning point for the galaxy, yet the narrative offered minimal evidence that his presence altered the strategic environment in any measurable way. The introductory scenes positioned his reappearance as a shift in power, but the surrounding events did not escalate in proportion to that framing, creating a gap between the implied stakes and the observable outcomes. This disconnect set the stage for an arc where the idea of Thrawn mattered more than his direct influence, establishing a cinematic opening built on anticipation rather than demonstrable action. The early sequences focused heavily on characters discussing Thrawn's significance, but the story rarely allowed him to display the analytical methods that defined his prior portrayals. His established process of assessing cultural patterns, examining artistic expression, and predicting tactical behavior was absent, replaced by broad directives that could have been issued by any high-ranking figure. Without scenes showing him studying enemy tendencies or responding with tailored countermeasures, the audience received statements about his expertise rather than concrete demonstrations of it. The narrative introduced logistical challenges that could have anchored a strategic showcase, yet these opportunities passed without detailed exploration. Scenes involving resource shortages, fragile alliances, or contested territory could have provided platforms for analytical maneuvers, but the writing moved quickly through these moments, leaving them as background conditions instead of catalysts for problem-solving. Thrawn's dialogue referenced complications, but his solutions lacked the step-by-step logic that once defined his decision-making, resulting in a portrayal that felt detached from his legacy of operational precision. A key expectation surrounding Thrawn's return was the reintroduction of his adaptive style, which historically relied on rapid assessment and recalibration. However, the story framed his actions as fixed responses rather than evolving plans. Instead of adjusting to new information or reinterpreting variables mid-scenario, he issued linear commands that did not reflect the layered analysis associated with him. This static approach created a contrast between the character's reputation and his on-screen activity, reducing the sense that he was tracking multiple contingencies or anticipating shifts in the battlefield environment. The pacing of his strategy also remained unusually passive. Thrawn typically initiates sequences of controlled escalation, using calculated pressure to weaken opposing forces. In this version, he waited for developments to unfold and responded with minimal variation, suggesting a reactive model rather than an anticipatory one. For example, attempts by the protagonist to disrupt his plans resulted in broad responses rather than specific countermoves, implying that the commander who once predicted fleet trajectories and psychological triggers now defaulted to generic patterns that any officer could replicate. Thrawn's presence within the Imperial hierarchy once introduced internal dynamics that clarified his role in shaping policy and doctrine, yet this return scarcely engaged with the broader political framework of the era. The New Republic's fragmented leadership, inconsistent enforcement, and uneven regional control offered multiple avenues for exploitation, but the writing did not allow Thrawn to probe these weaknesses or manipulate them methodically. Without scenes depicting diplomatic pressure, information control, or indirect destabilization, the portrayal omitted the systemic strategy that once distinguished his campaigns. The story also avoided presenting detailed assessments of his adversaries. Historically, Thrawn forms profiles of opposing commanders, identifying cultural influences, psychological tendencies, and tactical patterns. Here he offered minimal commentary on the individuals targeting him, leaving the viewer without evidence that he understood their strengths and weaknesses. The absence of this analysis removed one of the core mechanisms that typically drives his victories, as the audience could not observe him constructing or testing hypotheses about enemy behavior, which weakened the impression of his strategic depth. Several sequences that could have displayed operational creativity instead leaned on conventional decisions. For instance, choosing familiar defensive arrangements or retreat patterns diminished the sense that Thrawn was evaluating unique variables or employing calculated misdirection. A character known for restructuring battlefields, redirecting resource flows, and manipulating timing windows instead relied on broad tactics that rarely extended beyond standard procedure. This simplified approach made it difficult to track any overarching plan or identify the distinct logic that once defined his command structure. The absence of consequential interactions with the New Republic further limited his narrative impact. Prior iterations of Thrawn derived strength from his ability to assess political climates, exploit ideological divides, and understand civilian sentiment. By not engaging with the government he was positioned to challenge, the story removed the comparative framework that previously highlighted his competence. Without analysing legislative bottlenecks, communication failures, or jurisdictional inconsistencies, Thrawn remained isolated from the systemic features of the galaxy that his strategies once reshaped. The final stages of his arc relied heavily on the story, granting him success rather than showing him earn it. Progression through key events depended on minimal resistance or broad narrative allowances rather than precise execution. The escape sequence, which should have crystallized his analytical approach, unfolded without showcasing meaningful strategic layers or risk evaluation. As a result, the outcome felt predetermined rather than the product of calculated planning, reducing the impression that Thrawn influenced the scenario through expertise rather than circumstance. This portrayal created an arc where Thrawn's reputation overshadowed his observable performance. The story told the audience he was a formidable strategist without providing the sequences needed to validate that claim. His decisions lacked the analytical rationale that once drove his victories, his influence on the galaxy remained limited, and his presence produced fewer structural consequences than expected. The result was a return framed as monumental, but executed with minimal demonstration, leaving a narrative shaped more by implication than by evidence of strategic mastery. One of the clearest indicators of limited narrative intention was the lack of procedural detail in Thrawn's planning. Effective portrayals of strategic characters rely on step-by-step logic that allows viewers to understand how decisions arise from analysis rather than convenience. Instead of structured assessments or layered contingency planning, the writing presented simplified directives that did not reveal underlying logic. Scenes involving resource allocation, threat prioritization, or risk calculation unfolded with minimal explanation, leaving the impression that decisions emerged from narrative necessity rather than from Thrawn's internal framework of evaluation. By withholding the logic behind his choices, the story prevented him from demonstrating the analytical transparency that distinguishes him from conventional antagonists. Another missed opportunity stemmed from the absence of diagnostic reasoning, which is central to Thrawn's methodical approach. This character typically breaks problems into discrete components, evaluates them independently, and then synthesizes a plan that accounts for variables others overlook. In this return, conflicts were handled at surface level, with little evidence that Thrawn examined the structural causes behind disruptions or assessed the deeper implications of the protagonist's actions. Without scenes showing him dissecting patterns, recognizing anomalies, or predicting behavior based on subtle cues, the story diminished the procedural discipline that once defined his decision-making style. The writing also constrained Thrawn's operational reach by limiting his interaction with secondary systems that could have highlighted his adaptability. In prior stories, Thrawn often examined transport routes, communication channels, and logistical dependencies to find non-obvious leverage points. Here, the environment around him remained static, with few sequences exploring infrastructure, supply pathways, or information flow. The absence of these supporting elements removed opportunities for him to manipulate structural weaknesses, stage indirect maneuvers, or influence events through controlled disruptions. This created a portrayal focused narrowly on immediate engagements rather than the broader system-level manipulation that once amplified his influence. The narrow scope of his actions also produced a static relationship with the narrative timeline. Thrawn's most effective arcs typically involve altering the pace of conflict through acceleration or delay, using timing as a strategic instrument. In this instance, events unfolded without meaningful temporal manipulation. The pacing did not reflect calculated delays, forced errors, or momentum shifts engineered by Thrawn. Instead, the sequence of events progressed at a uniform rhythm that conveyed little sense of strategic modulation. Without examples of him exploiting timing windows, coordinating multi-stage maneuvers, or compressing the decision cycle of his opponents, the portrayal lacked temporal complexity. A significant omission involved Thrawn's analytical engagement with environment and terrain. This character has historically leveraged spatial understanding to design advantageous formations, anticipate enemy positioning, and shape the flow of battle. In this return, environments functioned as backdrops rather than strategic assets, minimizing opportunities for spatial reasoning. Key locations were not examined for structural strengths, traversal challenges, or visibility considerations, nor did Thrawn appear to evaluate how the terrain could be used to restrict enemy mobility or funnel opposition forces. By overlooking spatial calculus, the writing removed another dimension of strategic expression. The portrayal also underutilized data interpretation, a crucial element of Thrawn's methodology. Historically, he analyzes incomplete or ambiguous information to form accurate predictions, demonstrating an ability to extract signal from noise. Here, data points were presented, without showing his process of weighting them, comparing patterns, or reconciling contradictions. Without observable data filtration, or hypothesis testing, Thrawn appeared to accept information at face value, rather than questioning or refining it. This weakened the portrayal of a commander known for transforming limited intelligence into decisive insight. Another limitation was the lack of counter-strategy against the protagonist's improvisational tactics. Thrawn is often defined by his ability to anticipate unconventional behavior, yet the writing portrayed him as reacting to disruptions rather than exploiting the vulnerabilities created by them. When the heroes adapted or deviated from expected trajectories, the responses did not display the analytical precision needed to convert their improvisation into liabilities. By failing to illustrate how Thrawn recalibrates in real time, the story presented him as rigid rather than flexible, undermining the adaptability that historically drives his most effective campaigns. The story further constrained his arc by not integrating ideological analysis into his decision-making. Thrawn's strength often lies in understanding why his opponents fight, not just how they fight, allowing him to predict actions based on motivation rather than position alone. Here, motivations were rarely examined, and Thrawn did not articulate theories about belief systems, moral frameworks, or personal incentives shaping his adversary's choices. Without this dimension, the portrayal reframed him from a commander who dissects psychological drivers to one who merely tracks movement and behavior, which limited the depth of his predictive reasoning. These limitations produced a portrayal shaped by constraints rather than characteristics, resulting in a version of Thrawn defined more by conceptual framing than demonstrable expertise. By restricting his access to analytical reasoning, systemic influence, environmental manipulation, and psychological interpretation, the writing created an incomplete representation that did not align with his established legacy. The conclusion that emerges is not that Thrawn failed, but that the narrative did not equip him with the tools needed to demonstrate strategic significance. In effect, the character returned without the structural support required to validate his role, leaving an arc that serves future setup without providing substantive evidence of the capabilities that once distinguished him.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.